Hello, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your host, Luke Johnson, coming to you once again from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more history. And since we're on an Americana kick, I thought an appropriate episode after the history of Independence Day would be the history of America's favorite spectator sport, NASCAR, or more specifically, stock car racing. That's right. Stock car racing is the most popular spectator sport in this country. I know that some people can't see the point of driving around in a circle going over 100 miles per hour. However, I like to take a look at the history of the sport because it is truly fascinating. And some of you out there might be wondering, what is the difference between stock car racing and just regular automobile racing? Well, that's what I'm about to tell you. By strictest definition, stock car racing is a form of automobile racing run on oval tracks and roads measuring approximately a quarter of a mile to 2 miles. And by strict definition, a stock car is an ordinary car that has been modified for racing. And that still holds true to this day, because most of the cars you see running on the tracks at Talladega, Daytona, or any of the other NASCAR tracks are usually regular cars that have been modified. Having said that, however, the definitions don't go very much into history. But that is why I am here. And so, please stick around as we dive into the history of stock car racing and NASCAR. Boogity 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 boys, let's go racing into history. Automobile racing had been in existence since the early days of automaking. First official car race was organized in 1894. It was an 80-kilometer reliability race that took place on the road between Paris and another town, and the first official car race took place in America. The average speed was 10 miles per hour. However, by 1900, cars could easily get up to 49, almost 50 miles an hour. However, these cars were specifically designed to reach those speeds, and the models made were not for the American public, they were strictly for racing. So as you can see, this type of auto racing bore little resemblance to stock car racing. For stock car racing, we have to move forward a bit in time. The year was 1919. America had just won the First World War and the boys were finally coming back home. However, a new war would begin with the law and the American people. In 1919, a new law had been passed ratifying the 18th Amendment to the Constitution that would therefore ban the sale of recreational alcohol, a time known as Prohibition. Many people were still thirsty, however, and organized crime came into hand, and so many gangsters began setting up speakeasies, which were underground bars. And they needed the alcohol to be transported. And how was it transported, you may ask? Rednecks. That's right, hillbillies. To get the alcohol transported, the gangsters relied on backwoods people to brew moonshine and then transport it to the speakeasies. This was a practice that was done from North Carolina to Washington State, and everywhere in between, but especially in the South. Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, especially places with mountains, Arkansas, southern Missouri, but especially North and South Carolina. And to transport the liquor, the folks needed fast cars to elude the police and the feds, or the revenuers, as they were often called. Dang revenuers! The idea was relatively simple. Take an automobile that looked completely inconspicuous, something you'd easily see on the streets every day, modify the engine for greater speed, or remove it completely and replace it with one with more power and speed, remove the floorboards, passenger seats, and back seats to store as many cases of alcohol as possible, amp up the suspension by installing extra suspense springs to handle the weight, add a dirt protecting plate in front of the radiator, and then run the prohibited booze to the customers. And to elude the authorities, the drivers would run at night and speed along dirt, gravel, single lane, and sometimes paved roads, if they were lucky, at breakneck speeds with their headlights turned off to not attract attention. And if it sounds like dangerous work, it's because it is. The cars could range from everything from Model Ts to Chryslers during the early years, and ironically, it was a complete abstainer from alcohol who made the biggest contribution to Ridge Runners, as these boys were called. In 1932, Henry Ford debuted the new Ford Model 18 with a V8 motor. The car became extremely popular among moonshine runners and outlaws alike. It was the regular getaway car that Clyde Barrow tried to use if he could steal one in many of his and Bonnie Parker's bank robberies if he could. This is ironic because Henry Ford himself was a complete abstainer who banned his own employees from drinking. However, this definitely did not stop the fellas in the backwoods of the South from using the Ford V8 to do their runs. Neil Thompson, the author of Driving with the Devil, Southern Moonshine, Detroit Reels, and the birth of NASCAR, said of the Ford V8, bootleggers had experimented with different cars over time, but they were never quite fast enough for their tastes. It turns out Ford accidentally created the perfect moonshine delivery vehicle. Thompson also said of the Ford V8, with the Ford V8, suddenly there was an engine that was a match for their profession. It was fast enough to stay one step ahead of the law, rugged enough for the mountain roads, and had a big enough trunk and back seat to squeeze in the moonshine. And so, relatively easily, mechanics could soup up the Ford V8 to gain a few extra miles per hour, and that could definitely make the difference in car chases. However, one trick that bootleggers did that definitely did not carry over into modern NASCAR was they added features that honestly seemed like something straight out of a spy movie. Devices that, with the press of a button, could release smoke screens, oil slicks, and even bucket loads of tacks to puncture the tires of their pursuers. I had a sharp idea to outrun the feds. As Prohibition came to an end in 1933, it did practically nothing to stop the flow of illegal liquor, at least in the South. People still had a craving for corn mash whiskey, or moonshine as it is commonly known. And so, throughout the 30s, the moonshiners began to race their cars during the daytime. They would race at fairgrounds and racetracks and found that tens, sometimes even thousands of people would come to see them race. And this soon gave way to legitimate racing teams. The first to do so was a man named Raymond Parks. He ran away from home in the mountains of northern Georgia at age 14 and became an apprentice to a moonshiner he had met in, of all places, the county jail while he was locked up for buying booze for his father. He'd made a fortune bootlegging. After that, he began to invest his ill-gotten gains in legitimate enterprises such as service stations and the growing sport of stock car racing. Parks didn't have to look any farther than his own family to find two talented drivers for his racing team. His cousins, Lloyd C. and Roy Hall, happened to be some of the top moonshine runners in northern Georgia. They would evade capture with their sheer speed and very daring 180-degree hairpin turns. And just down the road from one of the service stations Parks owned was the garage of a man named Red Vogue, who was known as the bootlegger's mechanic. Harold C. run the first big stock car race in 1938 at Atlanta's Lakewood Speedway in front of 20,000 fans. And Roy Hall would eventually win the National Stock Car Championship in 1941. And when stock car racing resumed after World War II in September 1945, a riot almost broke out at Lakewood Speedway after police banned 5 racers, including Hall, who had been convicted of liquor hauling violations. 30,000 fans were chanting for Hall, who had had his driver's license revoked after being arrested no less than 16 times. The authorities relented and let the bootleggers race, and Hall took the checkered flag. However, Atlanta did not welcome the moonshiners back, and another top stock car driver named Bill France began to recruit the bootleggers to race in Virginia and the Carolinas. And in December 1947, Bill France assembled the leading stock car drivers, mechanics, and owners in Daytona Beach, Florida, to standardize rules, and that was a meeting that would create the formation of the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR for short. And so it should be obvious that without Prohibition, there would be no NASCAR. The two are conjoined at the hip. Yes, had it not been for alcohol, people like Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt Jr., Dale Earnhardt Sr., Junior Johnson, no relation by the way, would not be as famous. And so of all the bad things to come out of Prohibition, I'm glad that this is definitely one positive. And I should note, it has always been a dream of mine to one day build a historically accurate hot rod. Something that the good old boys back in the backwoods of the South would have used to haul moonshine. I know I currently don't have the funds to do it, but hopefully someday I will. It will happen. Mark my words. It will happen. I don't know when, but it will happen. Now I would like to say, although I have thoroughly enjoyed making this podcast, I would also like to hear your input from it. What do you want to hear next, for example? What would you like episodes to be about? What do you want to hear the history of? If you have ideas for future episodes, you can contact me at bowtietalkspodcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's bowtietalkspodcast@gmail.com. BOWTIETALKSPODCAST@gmail.com. And also be sure to like and follow the Bowtie Talks Podcast with Luke Johnson Facebook page and Instagram page. Seriously, folks, I need to get more followers. And with that, I hope you've enjoyed our little walk through the history of NASCAR and American stock car racing. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.